What if what you call consciousness wasn't just your thoughts or attention, but the cultural lens through which you see the world? Imagine waking up every day and seeing reality through the same eyes, not your physical eyes, but the invisible eyes of the mind, of what you understand as yourself. Now imagine that these eyes were shaped not just by your thoughts, but by everything around you. Your language, your religion, or lack thereof, the school you attended, your parents' tone of voice, the way your city deals with time, with pain, with others. Consciousness, this word we carry as if it were an exclusive gift, is, in fact, a tapestry. Neurological and cultural threads woven together in silence, defining what we call I. What if your way of thinking, feeling, loving, or even suffering was inherited? What if it were more connected to the collective unconscious than to your individual essence? For a long time, we believed the mind was an island, isolated, rational, free. But contemporary neuroscience and cultural psychology are revealing another truth. The mind is an open system, interdependent, a field where biology and culture dance. When we talk about stages of consciousness, we're not just talking about inner evolution, but about civilizational stages. Every level of individual consciousness reflects and influences collective ways of life. Entire peoples can organize themselves around consciousness rooted in fear, in empathy, in power, in transcendence. And each stage leaves traces in its politics, its myths, its wars, and its healing. In this script, we'll embark on a journey through the 6 main levels of human consciousness, from the biological base of survival to the peaks of non-duality. Each stage will be examined through 2 complementary lenses. The neuroscientific lens, which reveals how specific brain areas are activated, how reward circuits and attention networks sustain different forms of perception. And the cultural lens, which shows how these individual experiences shape and are shaped by social institutions, traditions, collective narratives, and power structures. You'll discover that consciousness is not static nor exclusively yours. It breathes with the collective. It moves with history. It vibrates according to time. And perhaps most importantly, no stage is better than the other. Each serves a vital function in the spiral of life. The problem begins when we get stuck in one of them, or when an entire society builds its foundations on a level of consciousness that can no longer sustain the complexity of human existence. The question I leave echoing before we begin is this: what stage is your consciousness in today? And what stage is the consciousness of the world around you? Let's find out together. Survival shapes everything, from the architecture of a slum to the politics of a totalitarian state. Imagine consciousness as a house with multiple floors. The first floor, the lowest and most essential, is the consciousness of survival. Here, everything revolves around a single urgency: making it through one more day. From a neuroscientific perspective, this level is deeply rooted in the most primitive systems of the human brain. When we're pushed to the limit, whether by hunger, violence, abandonment, or extreme pain, we enter what's known as survival mode, a state dominated by the neural triad: the amygdala, hypothalamus, and HPA axis, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal. These structures don't ask what is right or wrong. They simply react. The limbic system, especially the amygdala, is responsible for assessing threats and sounding the alarm. The fight or flight response is not a rational choice. It's a biochemical impulse. The release of cortisol, adrenaline, and other stress hormones prepares the body for confrontation or escape. Digestion stops. Creativity goes silent. Empathy is shut down. All that matters is survival. The curious part is that, even in modern contexts, our ancestral brain still activates these networks as if we lived in the wild. Sudden unemployment, a robbery, an eviction threat, or an abusive relationship can trigger the same brain state as a trapped animal. And when this becomes chronic, the mind is shaped by scarcity, and everything around starts to reflect that filter. But this consciousness isn't just individual. It becomes collective. From a cultural standpoint, when entire groups are kept in a constant state of deprivation through war, exploitation, colonialism, ecological collapse, a culture based on fear, rigidity, and authoritarianism emerges. Just look at regions marked by armed conflict, structural poverty, or environmental disasters. The priority shifts from human flourishing to control. Surveillance policies, harsh punishments, rhetoric about the internal enemy, exclusion, and blind obedience become the norm. The media in these contexts doesn't educate, it alarms. School, instead of fostering creativity, prepares for submission. Everything becomes a containment strategy. It is at this stage that the most rigid and vertical power structures are born. Punitive religion, the violent father, the oppressive hierarchy, fear as the social mortar. And all of this happens because, when survival is the only possible reality, any threat, real or symbolic, becomes unacceptable. Otherness, doubt, and change turn into existential dangers. This level of consciousness, though often demonized, plays a vital role. It protects us. It ensures the body stays alive, even in the worst scenarios. It gave us the chance to endure as a species. But when we remain in this state for too long, we pay a steep price. The heart hardens, the mind closes, others become enemies, and life becomes a battlefield. Survival consciousness is the foundation of the house of the mind. But no one was born to live forever in the basement. Are you ready to climb to the next floor? The fear of tribal abandonment lives on today in the fear of an unfollow. If survival consciousness taught us how to protect the body, emotional consciousness teaches us how to protect our bonds. It's the stage where danger is no longer just physical, but emotional. The threat no longer comes only from an external predator. It comes from the gaze of the other. Neurobiologically, this stage is still strongly linked to the limbic system, but with more refined nuances. The hippocampus, which stores and organizes emotional memories, takes center stage. Alongside it, the insula and amygdala remain on high alert, but now they respond not only to danger, but also to judgment, rejection, affection, and social exclusion. We are tribal beings. We evolved in groups. And for most of our evolutionary history, being expelled from a group meant death. That's why the pain of social exclusion activates the same brain regions as physical pain. This isn't a metaphor. Functional MRI scans show that a broken heart, romantic rejection, or public embarrassment trigger the brain's pain circuits. This emotional sensitivity builds a mind shaped by reaction. We love those who welcome us. We attack those who threaten us. We assign intentions to others based on our emotional memory, not on objective facts. Emotional consciousness is deeply reactive. In daily life, this translates into outbursts of anger, jealousy, fear of loneliness, and a constant need for validation. It's the mind desperately trying to ensure its place in the group, whether that group is family, friends, nation, or social network. Now think about the collective impact of this. Entire cultures can operate at this level of consciousness, where belonging is the most valuable asset, and the threat to that belonging the greatest sin. This is where extreme nationalism, religious fanaticism, political cults, and ideological tribalism are born. It's also the fertile ground for what's now called cancel culture. We're no longer burning witches in public squares, but we're burning reputations in real time. Because the emotional collective unconscious behaves like a massive herd, anyone who threatens the group's cohesion is excluded, attacked, silenced. And often not out of malice, but out of fear. Fear of being excluded too. Just look at how organized fan groups, digital echo chambers, and radical movements operate. They offer unconditional love as long as you obey. Any deviation in loyalty is seen as betrayal. Affection becomes a tool of control. At its core, this stage reveals a profound truth. Our deepest hunger isn't for food, it's for connection. But when that connection is conditional, it becomes a prison. When emotion is unregulated, it becomes war. And when pain goes unhealed, it is passed down as emotional inheritance. This level of consciousness, though turbulent, is necessary. It's where we learn to feel, to love, to suffer, and to care. It's where the inner child cries out, seeking comfort. The problem begins when an entire society becomes a playground for wounded egos and unhealed emotions. When empathy becomes selective and affection is used as a weapon. But there is a way beyond reactivity, a bridge that links the heart to the mind. Are you ready to cross it? Reason took us to the moon, but didn't teach us how to deal with the emptiness upon returning to Earth. After facing the fear of death and rejection, an impulse is born within us, the drive to understand. A desire to organize the world through logic, to name emotions, to build systems, to establish order. It is at this point that we emerge into the domain of rational consciousness, the stage where thought becomes structured, sharp, and seeks to explain everything. In the field of neuroscience, this level is led by the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. This is where the brain begins to master executive functions: planning, analysis, abstraction, language, inhibitory control. At the same time, the so-called default mode network, DMN, comes into play. A network of brain regions that activates when we are at rest and begins to construct the narrative of the self. This network is responsible for self-reflection, for simulating future scenarios, and for maintaining a coherent identity over time. It's thanks to it that we say, "This is who I am." But it's also what traps us in inner stories, in comparisons, in judgments, in a self that needs to be right, to prove its worth, to win. Rational consciousness gives us the ability to move beyond raw impulse and instinctive emotion. We learn to pause reactions, to justify decisions, to construct arguments. It is at this stage that scientific thinking arises, along with moral codes and formal justice. We begin to live less in the now and more in the realm of what if. Culturally, this stage laid the foundation of modern societies. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason and progress, marked the rise of this level of consciousness. Democratic institutions, universities, constitutions, sciences, and technological revolutions are all legitimate children of the rational mind. But along with these achievements come excesses: extreme ideologization, the rationalization of suffering, the medicalization of the soul, productivity as identity. We've become experts at explaining the world, yet often incapable of feeling it deeply. We try to fix emptiness with logic. We measure love with statistics. We manage pain through diagnoses. We classify everything: disorder, pattern, dysfunction. Reason, which was meant to free us from fear and impulse, ends up being used as armor. We become professionals of control. And the unexpected, the mysterious, the silent, everything that cannot be quantified, begins to be discarded or feared. Our age is the age of performance. Resumes are carefully edited narratives of the ego. I think, therefore I am, has become, I produce, therefore I matter. Instead of liberating us from animality, rationality has often only refined primitive instincts with sophisticated arguments. Example? The meritocratic competition that justifies exclusion based on individual effort. The rationalization of someone else's suffering with statistics. War disguised as strategy. Exploitation repackaged as success formulas. Of course, this stage brought undeniable progress. It allowed us to transcend superstition, challenge dogma, heal disease. But it is not the end of the journey. It is a bridge between instinct and expanded awareness. The rational mind is an extraordinary tool, but dangerous when we forget that it is only that, a tool. The question is, who's holding the tool? The ego or consciousness? When reason serves the heart, great masters are born. When it serves fear, great manipulators emerge. We are ready for the next stage, the one where reason bows to empathy and thought learns how to listen. Shall we go? When empathy becomes a social norm, violence loses its meaning. Rational consciousness taught us how to think. Now it's time to feel deeply. At this stage, the mind begins to give way to the heart, not just as a symbolic organ of love, but as a center of relational wisdom. Here, the world is no longer an object to be analyzed, but another being to be embraced. From a neuroscientific perspective, this stage is marked by the activation of the medial prefrontal cortex, a brain region associated with empathy, compassion, and theory of mind, the ability to imagine the inner world of another. There is also a noticeable reduction in activity in the default mode network, DMN, allowing the focus to shift away from the constant I and expand into we. It's as if, by quieting the ego's narrative, the mind creates space to truly listen. Mirror neurons come into play, fostering emotional identification with those around us. We feel another's pain as our own, not out of ethical duty, but from a deep experience of emotional unity. This level of consciousness often arises after a breakdown in rationality. Plus, disillusionment with the system. Logical thinking failed to provide meaning, and it's then that something more subtle is revealed: the value of care. Heart-centered consciousness doesn't abandon reason. It transcends it with tenderness. It understands that being right is not enough. We must also be kind. That winning an argument means little if the relationship is lost. On a cultural level, this stage manifests in social movements rooted in care, inclusion, and empathy, human rights campaigns, restorative justice initiatives, compassionate environmental activism, emotional education in schools, solidarity-based economies. Here, we begin to hear phrases like education for emotional awareness, effective public policies, compassionate leadership, care as a revolutionary act. Societies beginning to operate at this level recognize that collective well-being isn't a utopia, it's social intelligence. That trauma, when ignored, becomes systemic, but when embraced, becomes healing. This stage also questions traditional success metrics. Listening, cooperation, and kindness begin to be valued over cutthroat competition and unchecked productivity. Mental health becomes a political issue. Inclusion becomes both an ethical stance and a practical commitment. And perhaps most beautifully, at this level, empathy ceases to be a personal virtue and becomes a cultural structure. Compassion is institutionalized. Care is compensated. Listening is taught. Affection is valued. But let's be clear, this consciousness is not romantic. It requires courage, because loving others means seeing their pain, and often touching it with the bare hands of presence. Heart-centered consciousness is, by nature, vulnerable. And it's precisely in that vulnerability that its strength resides. Neuroscience is beginning to confirm this. Studies on experienced meditators, active compassion practitioners, and community leaders show unique brain patterns, greater connectivity between affective and cognitive regions, improved emotional regulation, increased subjective well-being. In other words, care heals, both the giver and the receiver. When a culture begins to value the heart, it changes, not by force, but through emotional osmosis. Listening becomes practice. Touch becomes language. Silence becomes presence. And in that safe space, the other is no longer a threat, but a mirror. In this stage, what matters is not winning the debate, but preserving the bond. Not to convince, but to contain. And in that containment, a door opens to something even greater, something that transcends the human and touches the eternal. Are you ready to look beyond the heart and perceive the whole? Where there is no more separation, there is no more domination. Cosmic consciousness revealed to us the interconnection of all things. But even there was still an observer, a presence that felt one with the whole. In non-dual consciousness, even that disappears. There is no longer someone experiencing unity. There is only pure experience, only being. This stage is the hardest to describe because it transcends language, logic, and even the structure of the mind that seeks to understand. The masters of silence, like Ramana Maharshi, Eckhart Tolle, Nisargadatta Maharaj, or the ancient rishis of India, tried, with the fewest words possible, to point toward this state. But always with a reminder, the truth cannot be spoken, it can only be pointed to. From a neuroscience perspective, the non-dual state is still an emerging field of study. The reports are increasing, from mystics, advanced meditators, and people in altered states, but the brain markers remain subtle. What is known so far is that there is an almost total reduction in the default mode network, a collapse of the boundaries of self-image, and a diffuse activation of patterns resembling paradoxical sleep states mixed with heightened alertness. It sounds contradictory, and that's exactly how it's often described: a state of absolute emptiness and total fullness. A silent presence that perceives everything, yet identifies with nothing. A field where there is no longer subject and object, beginning and end, right and wrong. Culturally, non-dual consciousness has never been embodied by an entire civilization, but it has been the ideal of many spiritual and philosophical paths. In Zen Buddhism, it is called Satori. In Advaita Vedanta, moksha. In Taoism, it is the return to the Tao, the nameless flow. This consciousness does not create systems. It does not build empires. It dissolves structures. That is why it rarely becomes a dominant culture, but always inspires silent revolutions. Imagine a society where no one sees themselves as separate from another, where there is no need to defend an identity, where there is no desire to dominate or accumulate. where action arises spontaneously, like water flowing. Hard to imagine? But not impossible. There are glimpses of this in very small communities, in monks in hermitages, in meditators in silence, in intense moments between two human presences who, even for an instant, forget the ego and simply are. Non-dual consciousness does not seek to change the world. It is the world silently watching itself. And perhaps this is the most challenging invitation of all. To do nothing, to seek nothing, to become nothing, to be, without narratives, without promises, without illusions. Because when there is no more separation, love is no longer a feeling, it is the very fabric of existence. And truth, finally, stops being a concept and becomes a living presence. In this place, there is no religion, no science, no culture. There is only what has always been here, and what will always remain once the I finally rests. We have reached the summit, and like every summit, it does not invite us to live there, but to look clearly at everything below. Because true wisdom is not staying in the heights. It is descending with lightness, without forgetting the light we saw. Descending with awareness is just as sacred as ascending toward enlightenment. Up to this point, we've journeyed through a spiral, from the urgency of survival to the silence of non-duality. But it would be a mistake to imagine this path as a linear staircase, where each step replaces the one before. Consciousness does not move in a straight line. It pulses, oscillates, it breathes and spirals. We are cyclical beings, and each stage of consciousness we visited remains within us as a living layer ready to emerge when the moment calls for it. We might experience pure rationality in one moment, collapse into fear the next, and in a quiet afternoon, touch the cosmos while watching the sunset. That's not regression, it's human nature. True awakening isn't about reaching the top and staying there. It's about being able to move between the stages with clarity and compassion. It's understanding that fear still lives within us, but now we know how to hold it. That emotion may be intense, but it no longer needs to control us. That reason is useful, but it doesn't have to rule. That the heart beats, but can also rest. And above all, that non-duality does not reject the earlier steps. It includes them. It observes without clinging, but honors them as part of the whole. The same is true for cultures. Societies oscillate between cycles of trauma and opening, between rational and mystical phases, between authoritarianism and collective compassion. No society is purely in one stage. But we can ask, at what level is it anchoring its decisions, its laws, its education, its myths? And perhaps the great challenge of our time is this: to ensure that the higher stages are not just rare individual experiences, but become structuring cultural references. That care is not the exception, but the foundation. That empathy is part of every school curriculum. That spirituality is not dogma, but a space for deep listening. That reason serves the heart, not the market. That fear is treated as collective trauma, not as a justification for oppression. Integration is this: allowing each layer of consciousness to find its place in harmony, without hierarchy, without repression. A balanced psychic organism, a social body in resonance. Because true spiritual and cultural maturity is not about avoiding darkness. It is about bringing light into every corner of the mind, without haste, without denial. And when we do this, we realize that consciousness is alive, that it doesn't need to be controlled, only understood, that it is not a ladder of ego, but a dance of presence. Ascending is necessary, but descending with awareness is sacred. We are not here just to survive. We are here to awaken together. Consciousness is the invisible foundation upon which all our choices, societies, and stories are built. It is not just a private, internal, spiritual experience. It shapes the tangible world, political systems, emotional relationships, cities, wars, and healing. And at the same time, the world shapes consciousness in return, like a dynamic mirror that never stops transforming. Returning to the central thesis of this journey, the stages of consciousness are not only personal, they shape entire cultures. And for that reason, understanding consciousness is also a political, ethical, and collective act. You are not alone in your awakening process. Every time you regulate your anger, listen with empathy, embrace your shadow, or contemplate mystery without grasping for easy answers, you are creating space for a new culture to be born. The question left behind is not only what stage is your mind in, but also, what stage are your daily choices in? What stage is your community in? What stage is the content you consume in? What stage is the future you're feeding? We are living at a threshold moment, where different levels of consciousness coexist in tension, where entire cultures swing between fear and compassion, control and trust, ego and silence. But we are also living in an era of unprecedented possibility. Never before have so many human beings had access to the knowledge, practices, and experiences that for millennia were reserved for a few. Meditation is in schools. Neuroscience is studying compassion. Spirituality is meeting quantum physics. Trauma is being named. And listening is being taught. Perhaps, for the first time, we have the chance to integrate all stages. And that integration begins within you. Not with the ideal of an enlightened self, but with the simple act of not reacting with hatred, of listening, of pausing, of feeling, of being. The collective leap to a new consciousness will not come from above. It will come from within, from ordinary people who choose to live with more presence, more truth, more tenderness. If you've made it this far, it's because something inside you recognizes the spiral. Because you know, even if silently, that consciousness is more than a biological process. It is life itself remembering itself. So, as you leave this video, carry this question with you. What within you has already awakened, and what is still asking to be seen with more awareness? The answer doesn't matter. What matters is the gaze, and the path that gaze begins to open.